We can call to mind a million different ethical issues around XR and entertainment. All of us can. So we've had conversations together and individually about the issues that we think are maybe most interesting and gnarly that we'd like to talk about today. In particular, though, I want to say that concerns about privacy and safety and many other ethical issues will be addressed by Kent Bai in his keynote tomorrow afternoon at 3. And that's offered by the Virtual World Society. And Nicole Lazzaro will be speaking on ethics, UX, and UI standards tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So there's even more ethics coming your way. Although we had some great introductions here, I would like to give each of you a chance to introduce yourselves and tell us a little more about what you do. Samantha?
Hi, I'm Samantha Gorman. I'm the co-founder and head writer of Tenderclaws, and we're a studio that works with platforms and emerging tech to kind of innovate them more in narrative and gameplay ways, but also create new approaches to technology. So for Tendar, which I'm going to talk about, we have using machine learning. We're doing some immersive theater VR intersections, but I'm also a PhD historian in immersive media.
Cool.
I'm David Levitt, CEO of Pantomime Corporation, and our company specializes in a different kind of ubiquitous immersive reality where we use multiple screens, could be handheld screens, could be desktop screens, and you're seeing into virtual worlds through them, and where the mobile devices in particular are effectors that let you reach in. And I'll say more about how we specialize, if you will, in the native experience. In other words, you may not need a headset, and in fact, there's all sorts of reasons why you might want to be looking through a handheld device, a la Pokemon Go, but with more accuracy and realism.
Cool.
Nicole Lazzaro from Xeodesign, and we're a VR developer, VR AR developer. Game industry vet for 26 years, and among other things, I designed the first iPhone game. And I have a model, the 4 Keys to Fun, which we're using now in XR for this series, Follow the White Rabbit. So we're bringing an adventure game to VR and XR. And it's given us a lot of chances to think about, it's a global empathy game, and it's given us a lot of chances to think about ethics and what our role is as creators in regards to our audience. Like, what is our relationship and what can we do? So I'm super excited to be invited here to talk about this today.
Great. I'm Brenda Laurel. I've been in the business since 1976. My husband, who's in the front row here, and I and some other folks did big VR back in 1992. Ethics has always been close to my heart in the game industry, so I'm really excited to be having this conversation with these wonderful people today. So one of the first issues that came up for us as we were having our conversations was, what are the appropriate boundaries in imaginary worlds when things are in a near reality situation? What kinds of boundaries do we need to express and create, and where can we get into trouble if we don't? So I'd like to start that one by talking to David.
Oh, okay. And so in a way, immersive reality is about fooling people, and that's what makes the boundary navigation so tricky. If I have a space that has a virtual banister, and I might say, oh, this great new haptics system that I'm using will let me feel the banister when I touch it, and if I was standing near such a banister, I might like to fondle that, and I would do some pantomime or something, and then someone else would lean on it and die because there's no real banister there. So the fooling people thing has to have boundaries. There might want to be a special kind of haptics where it pulses or does something that a real banister would never do, so that you never mistake it for one and try and put your weight on it. In a way, I think there'll be some kind of an Asimov or Maslow-like set of laws where safety is first and socialness and good works in the world are at the outer layer. But safety obviously is the key. and allowing magic without letting it be dangerous.
Nicole?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think first of all, we're on a panel on ethics, and I thought it was really interesting that, like, well, what is ethics, right? It is, these moral codes, just to center us a little bit. It allows us to affirm our values as a society. It's not a law, it's not the government coming in, but it's what we as a community, a community of creators or a community with our audience, what is it that we agree to? And what are the values that we want to reinforce, explore, change, move around? And I think that's, it's not just a this is good or this is bad sort of thing, and although we will talk about that. But it's all about the well-being, design for the well-being of the group. That's what ethical codes are all about. And for me, why that's not a primary, design parameter of every company is like kind of a mystery, because that's certainly, certainly like where our mission is to basically unlock human potential through play. And so, like, where are these lines in the new, in these new frontiers? And then how is it that we, what is it that we do to cross them? And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the ethics and the psychology of immersive media, because it's so much more intense. It's going emotionally, and then even deeper than emotions. So, positionally and spatially, the hippocampus is getting activated, and so there's other stuff that's being affected by us or by these experiences. And so what is our role as creators about the impact that these things have?
So Nicole has just taken us all the way to the end of the panel. We'll get back to this. Samantha, do you have anything to add on the question of boundaries?
Yeah, so as a narrative designer and artist that works primarily with speculative fiction and comedy and satire, it's really all about the boundaries between verisimilitude and truth and comedy, and how to kind of engage your audience and talking about ethics and talking about these ideas through parody, right? And that is a sort of element of trust to take your audience to these virtual worlds you're creating. I think, like, to back up a second, like, the things that I'll talk about in this lens is Brenda's going to ask some questions about the reception of our project, Tendar. In addition, the background I'm coming from, which I think I need to say to contextualize a lot of this, is when I was a freshman in college very, very long ago, I was one of the poets they brought in to work with computer scientists in a cave virtual reality environment in 2002. I stayed there for 8 years. Where they basically were like, no object-oriented programming in Linux, go. And they just like put me in front of a computer. And over that time, while it was kind of VR was in a sort of winter, I was able to see a lot of development and evolution. But it became to a point where when I started my PhD, we were professionally counseled to not say VR in our CV because of the sort of area it had been in. But I was at USC, and Palmer Luckey was the assistant to my professor. So I saw that sort of rise and that situation, which created the surreal comedic approach to how I look at the industry today.
Cool. So yeah. So to expand on this a little bit, or maybe narrow it down, we talked a lot in terms of boundaries about personal agency and volition in terms of, what is a participant trying to do? What kinds of choices do they have? And I was thinking, a friend of mine, whom I won't name, who's sitting in the front row, reported a VR experience where she found herself holding a gun that was firing. So what do we call this? Are there other examples of this? Is this an ethical problem? What are some solution spaces? Nicole?
Okay, well, I think it's a really interesting question, especially like with the Dean Takahashi's article this morning. I come from the game space, and the new Call of Duty crosses quite a few bounds. So there are people in civilian clothes, there are children in the game. This is a war game where you have your main primary thing is a weapon.
It's a shooter.
It's a shooter, right? Yeah. And so, what is the responsibility on that and that? So I've done a lot of things, or I've been asked to do a lot of things in VR that I would never do in real life. From smoking something or harassing my daughter-in-law or with the rabbit. Yeah, no, this is all about finding the rabbit, not shooting the rabbit. But I think what happens is like when you think about that's all right. But when you think about like all of the media that we consume, I think we've got this situation where we almost have this forced bystander situation, where all of this, when we're looking on the news, all of these like very traumatic events, the impact that VR has, it can go really deep in our systems. And then you can create all these emotional responses. And then us as creators, what is our responsibility? Because what is the context? And when you create like Clouds over Cedra or these very intense, wonderful pieces, is there a context inside that experience, or maybe the context in which it's viewed for the user, for the participant to actually express the emotions that rise up, or perhaps even have some impact or act on those emotions in some way?
Yeah, we talked about Tree.
Yeah.
I was giving the example of I love Tree. I think it's have people seen this piece? So you might look it up online. You're growing from a seed to a large tree. It's a beautiful experience. The scale is handled fabulously. When the tree is fully in leaf, in the distance you see slash and burn farming, and you know that your tree is going to burn down, and there's nothing you can do about it. So David, you also referred to this as forced bystander.
Right. And let me step back a second, because I'm another VR old timer, or is it VPL, the company that sort of invented it and invented the term. But we have to be careful. There's a lot of unintentional propaganda that emerges. And yeah, forced bystander is a really good term for articulating some of it. And it comes from this, if you will, a perverted version of VR that started around 2014. Back in the old days, we wouldn't call it virtual reality if it wasn't multi-person, because reality is about consensus. And in a weird way, so we were serious. We called our product the Reality Built for Two, and we would call it a simulation or something, a game, something else, if it wasn't really consensual reality. Similarly, there's a period, I like to say that there was a really great Stephen Hawking simulation where you had no arms and no legs, and you could only turn your head and blink. Anyone know what it was called? Gear VR. Because you had so little agency in those kinds of environments, and you're hitting yourself on the temple in a way that would be embarrassing to him, and it's way less social than his life, I'm sure. But it was an artifact of the technology, right? Whereas at VPL, not to keep bragging, but we had the data glove first, and the head-mounted display was just a display in that sense. And when our favorite company, Facebook, decided that virtual reality was really all about no agency optional, social optional, lots of pixels and lots of high frame rate, it redefined what reality is in a really unpleasant way. Similarly, when people say, oh, in 5 years from now, everyone will be wearing headsets, and even if they're in the same room, or they won't have to know if the other person's around the world, but they'll be playing and socializing and it'll be great, what you're really saying is, that thing people used to do, eye contact and facial expressions, those were so unnecessary, overrated, and optional. So you have to be very careful about what you're envisioning. And part of the path that got me to Pantomime was, head-mounted displays are going to be the exception in mixed reality, not just because of cost, but because they're not native to the way we've been living. Holding something, if you've got an experience that starts with you taking your mobile device out of your hand and putting it on your face, then you're actually not in your native environment because your mobile device isn't in your hand. In a funny way, Pantomime became focused on exploiting the device that's already on your desk, that's already that's already part of your environment, and saying, oh, you can see this other world through it. And most importantly, the agency. Our algorithms let you paddle things, let you scoop things up in a virtual cup attached to your device, pour them out, squish things. And that actually is impossible with most current AR technologies, because that's just when the camera winds up going black and out of focus and failing.
So it's a bug squash fail.
So Pantomime Bug Farm and Pantomime Creatures AR, you can interact with things. You have way more physical agency than you do in other
And that
systems.
physical agency is really important, because that, in terms of like not being a bystander, if you're very emotionally aroused, if you're in a situation where where it's very that's a very negative situation, having some agency to correct that, or maybe I play it a second time and now I can prevent the disaster.
Right.
that's much more healthy for the individual.
Right, right. There's an innate passivity, and again, some of it came from technology that wasn't mature. But you also, I mean, obviously, also we have when we're crushing bugs, we want it to be a scary scorpion or whatever. Ethical things come in when you're thinking about killing an animal. But I think these other meta propaganda things are in some ways way more dangerous. There was the classic, arguably the thing last year for Facebook that was not as bad as Cambridge Analytica, but it was when Mark Zuckerberg put on his headset and said, "Look, I'm empathizing with the people in Puerto Rico."
Yeah. So I want to turn the focus to Samantha here for a minute, because she has a pretty interesting story to tell about one of her products that relates to this topic and also kind of has to do with squashing things. Her company is called Tender Claws, after all. So Samantha,
Yes.
has the Humane Society come to see you about the fish in your servers?
Yes, so that's a very loaded topic with a lot to unpack. And I'm gonna go back that I don't wanna interrupt people when they're speaking, but some of the points he brought up,
Sure.
I'd really love to respond to, and I think they're really important. Actually the important point about context. And that's something that we talk about in terms of design all the time, because there's a very different thing if you're primed to go into VR with a gun that's going to be shooting for a video game, versus if you're going into VR and you're suddenly startled that you're essentially in a torture simulation, right? And how you prime and set up those expectations for the users allow them to actually engage with the story in a very different way. But also be aware that there's an element where they're performing their performance of being in the headset for other people who are watching them engage in this experience that they know is happening. And that context is also, I think, really important. And in terms of Tree as an independent creator, I love Tree, and I think the creators are great. I wrestle a lot with this, where if you have, and it's kind of a fine line, because you want to create pieces that propel action, right? And empathy isn't necessarily adherent to action. But if you have a piece where you feel like there's a resolved or catharsis and you have agency in it, is that enough to talk about it later? Maybe those frustrations kind of, spawn conversation later on that can be I think, growthful.
With Tilt World, what we did is we actually provided the context of you earn points by gathering seeds and eating carbon out of the air, and then your points then get converted into trees planting in the ground. So, there was a little bit more agency there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so even if the agency is it's very Brechtian. This
Yes.
notion of the outcome being, the audience's outcome happening in the world after the end of the play.
Yeah.
But I do think, there's a cautionary note. I'm very engaged with climate change, as we all are, and I feel that we've learned that scaring the pants off of people and giving them no actionable course is really not a good strategy. And I can talk more about that later, but I want you to get to Tender because I think it's so interesting.
Definitely gonna do that, and actually, in terms of design, I think Brecht is a really important reference for theater of cruelty and the disruption of being able to think cognitively about the experience as you're in it, so you're not just immersed, but you're having a critical engagement. So Tendar, I need to probably show a trailer in order to preference this a little. We created this right kind of early on into ARCore, announced we're partners with ARCore, and we'll circle back to one of the conversations you want to talk to about privacy. But the reason that we created this is I wanted to do something that was AR, that was more about how to engage with the player's world in general, that wasn't just tabletop, that put in data and information about the player's world to feel like there was a story that was kind of about them, but that more importantly, in the future of AR, where there's layers of information over how we perceive each other and could engage with each other emotionally, what if we could get data about how others were feeling, and how would that change our relationship and how we negotiate with them? In addition, thinking about machine learning. But we'll talk about how all this was kind of an interesting story evolved into a conversation about trust. So this is our trailer. It's Android at the moment, and it uses sentiment and object analysis.
Move your cursor. There you go.
Sorry, there may not be audio, but you can imagine a jaunty tune.
So this fish is being fed by the emotions that the person holding the phone is collecting, right?
Yeah, and that's literally literally turned into food or pellets that you feed to the fish, and it evolves over 3 weeks of this story. So there's this back end of this kind of generative literature engine. And as he evolves, he gains language, and he learns how to understand objects in your world. And the thing that I think is important to mention is this is all mobile vision. This is all on device. We're not using the cloud. We're not sending or uploading any data. But where the Humane Society comes in is part of the speculative fiction is kind of making a reference to some of the early startups that are using sentiment analysis. And the language they use to talk about these ethical issues is like beyond parody. So we created this kind of fictional company where the premise of the technology was impossible because you have a fish in the server that's sort of based on a neural network of flatworm brains, where that is getting all your selfies and then like adjusting and creating like the data of like, you know, learning about human emotion and processing it through this algorithm and then sending it back to you. And when we staged this, we staged in kind of this speculative, this parafiction speculative future way where we had people in jumpsuits talking about the framing of this, this project. And it was at Sundance in 2018, and a lot of people really, you know, got it and understood it. And then we had this really interesting thing happen where some people came up to us and they're like, oh, you can make a lot of money on this if you really sell this data. You know, like, yeah, this company is like, this is gonna, you know, like gonna really take off. Or on the parallax, someone came up to us and came up to our representative and they're like, this is really dangerous. Like, how can you possibly do this to me? But the fact that people are still talking about this project and this installation is like what, you know, as me as an artist is really fulfilling. But when we released it, and I think this can segue into the privacy and trust, is we realized, okay, it's a better art practice in some way if we don't contextualize this, but because of the current climate of sensitivity, rightful sensitivities in some ways about this, we ended up at the beginning preferencing that like it was all on device, you know, making people comfortable so they can engage in the speculative fiction. That I really wanted to talk more about machine learning than like issues of like biometrics. And yeah, I'm happy to talk more as you want later on about that.
All right,
So.
well, thank you. Didn't some people get on you about abusing the fish?
Not so much abusing the fish, but we had this wonderful.
How could you do this to those fish?
we had there was somebody who was wondering, yeah, like there was like a PETA. PETA had this game called Sea Kittens, which was about taking, you know, fish and like making them into kittens so they're more relatable. And it was about like the metaphor of a fish and like how that was like dangerous for biological organisms to be like thought about AI in this way as it was undermining their inherent like, you know, like self. But yeah, it was more like the social media conversation around this was really interesting.
It's a dangerous mutant CRISPR catfish.
Yes.
I guess.
Yes. Well, this does take us right into the question
Yeah.
of trust and truthfulness. You can see how this is all connected. It's kind of been hard to carve out spaces in the conversation. But Samantha told me a story that a couple of months after you released this product, you want to tell them what happened?
I think, like, I mean, it's only a matter of time, especially if you follow how these companies evolve, but there's, like, life imitates art, I think. And I know there were conversations early on that we're having in Sundance, and the company that we were projecting as being this a guise of entertainment that people could engage with that would, you know, collect their emotions and understand who they were in order to, like, kind of sell it to aggregators became real. And there are companies that do that, especially now with kind of these sort of avatars that are using sentiment analysis.
So it's like Jon Stewart versus Colbert, right? I mean, everybody knew Jon Stewart was doing satire, but a lot of people believed Colbert was a right-wing asshole, you know, for a long time. So there's this fine line that you have to walk when you're using satire or humor in games. And that comes to an ethical issue. It comes to the issue of trust and the suspension of disbelief and the belief that no harm is coming to you. What do you think, Nicole?
Well, there's a contract as an entertainer and as a game designer that you have with the player that the game, in a sense, is winnable. There's a contract with the player or the audience member when they put it on a headset, whether it's AR or VR or loaded on your phone, that they're not going to be harmed. That it's an entertainment, it's for fun, there's no consequences. I'm not going to lose my job because I'm playing Pokemon Go. But I think that there's that contract, and I think going back to your point is that in humor, for humor to work, satire, but even humor in general, there's often that ring of truth, that element of truth that makes it really funny. If there's that little kernel, it makes it even more emotionally impactful. And then what we want to do though is we want to look as medium get more and more technological, like from the printing press, which was a high tech at one point in time, and now we've got these smart glasses. Technology comes with an aura of authority, and so that the message that we put out, these experiences that we create, can also get this halo of truth, and even when it's a complete falsehood.
Right. Although some falsehoods are more true than truth.
Very.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm going back to David's comment about fake empathy with the president's response, or I'm sorry, it wasn't the president, it was Zuckerberg's response to seeing the Puerto Rican storm and saying, look at me, I'm having empathy, Empathy is one of those things that can be abused.
People try really hard to fake it. It's a standard thing, I guess, and I don't have the automatic antidote, except that maybe the person, you have to have something in common with the person you're communicating with to begin with. So, I don't have $1,000 to have a headset good enough to empathize with the Puerto Rico victims is what's sometimes called a white people problem.
Right, yeah.
And if you could have a device that someone in Puerto Rico had working, that would be the beginning of some empathy with that.
Right.
But I think that's a good example of that idea that you can't that having that context, not by lacking the context for you to take action and actually interact with people.
Right. You're just a spectator.
You're just a spectator. You're not
how
really
entertaining. People swimming, people canoeing on a street.
Now we've been doom and gloom a little bit, but also on the other side of empathy is we do have the ability to create experiences. And so with me, VR, XR, AR is all of this trip to Wonderland. And I grew up overseas in Wonderland. I grew up riding camels, climbing pyramids, exploring fire temples, and I want to go back, to that place.
You
feel
just
that full body.
buy the plane ticket.
Well, that's what it is. Well, no, but it's it's not the same. But you could then, if you could take this, and then for empathy, and our goal with Follow Rabbit is so you can go to these different places and experience the cultures and have to understand a little bit about them and interact with them in order to solve the puzzles. We can create these experiences that are far beyond our boundaries.
Yeah, I think Charity Everett's work, which you will hear about later tonight, is remarkable in that regard.
Very
Samantha, I want to go back a little bit because we were talking about this issue of people being very skeptical about what you were doing and not trusting your disclaimers that everything was on device. When we were on the phone, you said that sometimes people were saying, I don't believe that all the data is just on the device. I think you are actually doing this tonight.
That wasn't necessarily the case. It was before we released it. We're on social media. There was someone who was hitting up all our channels and posting everywhere this is a marketing ploy thinly disguised as a narrative for this startup. And that was part of this element of what I like about narrative design and interactive media is the speculative fiction goes beyond just your game or just your product into a wider world that then helps build out the creation and helps be in dialogue, in conversation with the pieces you're making. So I think that's really important. And and some people answered that with all support. Yeah, they're yeah, that's right. This is the wave of the future. And it's oh, okay. But yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking about when we were all, I think it was Nicole and I having this conversation that, 10, 20 years ago in film, for example, we were seeing technology represented in a very almost utopian way. You remember the little girl in Jurassic Park who knows Unix and has a graphical UI, right? So there's this kind of happy tech that's going on. And then we come around to now, And what we're seeing are not only the negative images in film and television, but the actual negativity in the existence of things like Fox News and Facebook fake feeds. I want Nicole to talk about this a little bit, and David too.
Well, I think that what fiction does, and and documentaries as well, what the stories we tell, it is all about. It helps us understand our world, and it helps us to imagine what the future is like. So here's an experience that the rabbit had, or that David had, and now I'm going to learn from that. So when I'm in that situation, I might do the same, or I might do something that's different. And so we have this, so when we have these fictions like 1984, which we're living through now, there was some big warnings. We get these great concepts like Big Brother, or Room 101, and lots of really interesting things that help us understand and talk to each other. But on the other hand, we also need to have the protopia instead of the dystopia. We also need the protopia fiction. We also need these flights of imagination. And I think almost everybody in the room has heard of Star Trek, right? Yeah, and so has anybody not heard of Star Trek? Okay.
You may leave now.
You may leave now. Yeah. And so what's amazing about that particular franchise is it in the very restrictive, 1950s, 1960s, there was a lot of restriction in media, and what they were able to do is they were able to have very deep conversations of what was happening with the Cold War and stuff like that after World War II.
And race
and race. So they talked about race. They talked about the Klingons were lightly, thinly disguised, antagonists and stuff like that. They would rip headlines off the newspaper and then create stories about it. And so those stories helped us build this mental architecture and this vision of what could come in the future. So ethics is also about that, creating a moral code. Part of the moral code is also like, what do we aspire to? What are our future values? And all that science fiction stuff, a lot of that's actually happening because they got inspired. And I think that is on a technology side, like a tricorder or a replicator, and it's also on the moral side.
Yeah.
Like how do we, the Prime Directive and all of these other kinds of codes, moral codes that have come out of that franchise.
I know my kids, we used to watch Star Trek instead of church on Sundays. and they still say to me in their 30s, that was a world without money,
Yeah.
Why do we do that? It was like a real thought-provoking thing for them. I'm sorry if I've offended church ladies. So, David, what are your thoughts about this?
So yeah, on both the dystopian and utopian side, first off, my background before immersive reality was really artificial intelligence. And you could see, obviously, intelligent machines have a great upside when they work. But one of my advisors, Professor Weizenbaum, who had created Eliza, the therapist, the sort of dumb therapist that asks you a question about the last proper noun you said, and sounds like he's listening. He wound up changing fields, and he wrote a book called Computer Power and Human Reason, focusing on issues like, when they said, how many, maybe they were being sarcastic, how many Vietnamese are we just gonna have to kill? The computer said, 2 million, and you'll win, guaranteed. And computers becoming an oracle and people trusting artificial intelligence. In a funny way, it's the same as in immersive reality in a funny way. When you make a tree in virtual reality, the first time you make a draft, it's like, wow, is this dead and ugly? And suddenly you look at trees differently and they're richer, and you say the branches are more detailed and the wind actually has to go through it, and you wind up, frankly, they're delightful research fields for masochists, because it's a really hard problem that's actually harder than you thought.
Yeah.
And simulating intelligence is the same thing. Making a music improviser, you suddenly hear all the things that aren't in the score and that you'd never articulated before. And it's what makes it so exciting if you step up to it.
If you pay attention.
And if you don't, then it's the opposite. And you say, oh, that's enough, that's real, oh, that's intelligence. And you fall short and deny it in a dangerous, unhealthy way. Switching to a slightly utopian tack, I worked on a project taking Noam Chomsky's ideas and taking the semantic network that's actually got the entire Wikipedia mapped. Every page has a little bit, nugget of sparkle code. Picture the artificial, instead of taking over the world and destroying it, picture the artificial intelligence that says, wait a minute, you tortured these people, and you didn't ask them whether they should be compensated, and when someone else asked, you said, look forward, not back? Well, why are you surprised that this is the actual guy who founded ISIS? When are you going to commit to peaceful solutions rather than unaccountable or violent ones? So I'm picturing, I should have said it with a robot voice, but computers can be more ethical than people seem to be. And so if we put our Chomsky simulation in, computers can actually help solve the world's problems in a fun way. Everyone has seen these horrible things where Twitter, or I forget what lab, put up a Twitter bot that became a raging racist
Microsoft.
within just a few hours.
Yeah, Microsoft,
There are all kinds of examples.
But the opposite is also true, but you have to have the honest people, the ethically concerned activity to make it a realistic, smarter than us computer rather than as crazy and unaccountable as us computer.
Well, so this is, okay, so now we're wandering into intent, right? The intent of the maker, and the intent that drives the way the designer is evoking and using the emotion of the participant. And I know, Samantha, this speaks to some of your PhD research. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I do. There's something quickly I want to talk about the dystopian and the fact that, like, as an artist, as your intent, you're trying to say something, right? Like, I'm not trying to necessarily talk about, like, privacy, but because of the hot button issues, as soon as people hear the word privacy, it kind of shuts off a more nuanced discussion. And, like, partially that is, rightfully so, but in other ways, people can use your work to kind of contextualize a conversation of that it's not what it's about. And I think a lot of it is because we work with, like, large visible clients, those are moving targets, but in my personal experience, those are the people that are most careful about how their company is seen and perceived by a wider public. And, like, in the very back end of that, I have a lot of respect for that, but what we should be concerned about is actually smaller startups who are kind of, trying to, not really paying attention to that in order to, get their product across. And that is where, like, the more subtle and the more nuance happens, that is kind of overshadowed in the midst of these larger targets. And that relates also to intent in my research, because I think the main ethical thing about XR is not necessarily privacy and trust, and all these elements are inherent to digital media, but XR is this idea of immersion, and immersion is suspension of disbelief. And the intent of whose belief are you suspending and why and what purpose is super important to consider and to investigate. And the intent of the suspension of disbelief relates to, I think, advertising, messaging, which also relates to storytelling, which also is advertising with intent. Mm-hmm. So it's all bound up in this really complex and, like, beautiful, like, market, and I think, like, those sort of issues are things that we need to talk about in terms of ethical creation and representing stories and who and how you're representing and why.
Nicole?
Yeah, I really love this idea of bringing up suspension of disbelief, because what's interesting is on the McClellan scale, the VR, XR, AR, it's so hot, it is off the chart, right? There is, in a sense, I would argue there isn't any suspension, possible in a sense that, it is so hot. A lot of people probably don't have barriers to it.
That's true.
I interviewed Walter Murch, sound designer years ago, and oh my God. But he would say he loves sound design because, the eyes blink, but the ears never do. So you could get in there as an artist and, move people emotionally. In XR experiences, we often don't blink, right? You can't, close your eyes for that part. You can't, look at everybody on the theater, I'm going to eat my popcorn through this. There's not that boundary. And so I even wonder whether it's, possible to, that idea of suspension of disbelief is a very lovely concept. But in XR, it is so loud. It's a fire hose. It's taking over all of your senses.
Not necessarily. I will argue that the trope here, because so much of our interest in XR has been driven by gaming, that gaming folks in general really appreciate the super high resolution, super fast action stuff, and don't really understand the value of ambiguity and softness and cool media where we need to engage. So I think one of the stoppers we can put on the danger posed by misuse of immersion could be the notion of thinking more about creating cool media, using ambiguity, using pacing.
And
the
moments.
breadth. Yeah, and moments.
Yeah, little moments. I'm actually talking about white space tomorrow in my UX talk. And the
Don't be
importance of
offended,
that.
David.
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
I'm sure you meant something ethical.
Emptiness. I think that
a
was
white space problem.
It's a white space problem. Oh man, I stepped into that one. But yeah, I mean, the idea of having like the design of nothing and an easy fun of the 4 keys to fun, and, ambiguity in easy fun is a big part of it. There's ambiguity and there is like this mist or whatever. In mist, you go, or a Japanese garden, it's the space between the stones that makes those walkways so empowering or so impactful. And it isn't just like fire hose.
I think you're absolutely right. So I'm hoping you're hearing some solution ideas here, as well as just a lot of identification of things that could go wrong. I think we all have issues about misuse of immersive media for propaganda, for even unconsciously perpetuating, racism, et cetera. And I think that, I hope you've heard something about resolution, about pacing, and about ambiguity. I want to ask one last question, I guess. Because we're running out of time, and because we're also very smart and talk so much, I want to ask each of you to take a moment and give the audience some nugget or two of wisdom that you've taken away from your thoughts about these ethical issues. And I'd like to start with you, Samantha.
Sure. So actually, to help and talk a little bit about resolution is something that I think is really important to focus these panels on, so that's awesome. So in my PhD research, I actually studied the evolution of immersive media from Roman Villa 360 paintings to today, and tracing patterns of how those media are used and for what intent and by who. And within that, I kind of trace ways that we may ethically think about representation and different ways to create a more like empathetic media. And one is getting educated, looking at what has come before, what has worked for other people, knowing our history so that the new doesn't kind of rob our cultural memory in a way, I think is super important. But being able to create aesthetic distance. When you're in VR, you're not necessarily always immersed because there's their proprioception. You're aware of your body. You're aware what's around. It's like the author reminding you you're reading a book. How do we bring that into storytelling to create critical distance? Make sure that if you're representing someone's stories, like Carney and Irena, I think is the best example that does this, is you're working closely with the population or the person. 3 is like being able to like create some way of creating action. Or being able to see that literally and figuratively. Yes.
Yes. David, you're going to read us a treatise. I will stop you.
No, I wasn't.
Okay, all right.
I was just checking my notes whether I hadn't already shared the nuggets that I'd wanted to.
Well, you did give me a couple that you've already talked about, but the Apple example, right? And if Apple will not be building a headset like we see today.
Oh, well, probably the nugget that I was getting towards earlier is where and it overlaps with the ethics. These have to be native experiences. If you're doing something that can only be done in a laboratory, or only if you have $250,000 or even $1,000, you're creating something. You're creating inequality, among other things, and you're leveraging that. And what was so excited about what we started doing, and then what actually made a living for Pokemon Go, was these are devices that everyone already has. It's immersive in a way that doesn't steal your social identity or your face. And the ethics fall naturally out of the fact that you're really doing something that you do anyway, and the devices that you're holding are devices that almost everyone can afford.
Yeah. Nicole?
Yeah, I'd encourage folks to think of, in a sense, we can force people to be a bystander. We can also force people to have agency. So looking at the emotions and the role in which of the narrative and the purpose of what you're doing, what is your authorial intent with the piece, is super important. And I also encourage creators to look more deeply and reflect on what emotions are. We talk a lot about empathy, and we talk about narrative and arcs and stuff like that, but really emotions have many roles in the body. They are, we talk about action-emotion pairs when we do game design, and with the 4 keys at my studio. And emotions, thoughts, actions, they're all super intertwined. And when we have these very highly realistic, or very highly modal, or very, lots of modalities that you can go into, there's a lot more going on. So look at what the role of those emotions are, because emotions can make you feel. Emotions can encourage memories. They can facilitate, creativity. They can, they can also fear can also focus me on this, do this simple repetitive task, and move on. And I think that we look at what would it be? What were some really big amazing goals? Global empathy, or the ability to understand other people's emotions, or be able to lose weight or get more exercise. What are some really nice things? What is just simply laugh, right? And really have a good time. Connection. We haven't really talked too much about social connection, but we often think of these as, because of the hardware, it's their single player experiences, single person experiences. So what could we do as creators to really bring people together? Because our social media really isn't social. It's super thin. And the richness of VR and AR, the potential that we've got, the data we've got coming in, the data that's getting collected, the data that we can experience ourselves, that we have a lot of opportunities to be closer to our friends and unlock our potential.
And hopefully not give up eye contact. My nugget is just simply that I think we have tremendous power to model the good. And I don't see enough of that. And I don't imagine you do either. You can model the good through a satirical lens, through a humoristic lens, a humorous lens. You can model it through the lens of civitas, of history, of biology. There are a million ways we can be doing that, creating worlds that bring out the best of us and modeling worlds that work well. So those are our nuggets. I want to thank you all for being here.